Thanks for having me here this morning. That was pretty good, Bruce. I think I'm just going to call for offering, and then we'll close with some prayer. That's a pretty good message that you just brought there. For those of you who either you don't know me or you do remember me, I'm going to give just a quick update on where we're at, and just again want to thank you that you have, as a congregation, taken an interest in me and Julie's walk and our preparation to minister to the Twin Cities area, because we are currently planning to either plant a church or to open a new location of the church that we're currently at, Hope Community Church, which is located in downtown Minneapolis. And so we are about a year away from launching whatever it is, and we're hoping to decide by the end of the summer which of those things we're going to do. So you can be praying for us as we decide, do we want to plant a new church or do we want to open a new location of Hope? There are pros and cons that go with both of those things, and so both for us and maybe for the community or maybe for Hope as a church. This summer I'm actually serving as the pastor of a church in East St. Paul, whose other pastor is on sabbatical, which has been a really fun experience. Though for the day to come down and be with you today, so thank you for that, and hopefully they got it all figured out up there. Maybe they'll find someone in the congregation to preach. I didn't tell them I was leaving, so no, I'm just kidding. I did. Thank you all for your interest and your continued support, whether it's through prayer or just giving us opportunities to get experience in ministry by coming and preaching or helping out with the church in some way. So anyway, we are in a series on Mark. At least that's what Bruce told me. So maybe he's yanking my chain and just gave me a random passage in Mark to preach. I think you're in a sermon series on Mark. And we're preaching today on Jesus walking on water. It's a sermon series that many of you are I'm assuming, are familiar with. It's kind of a go-to Sunday school passage, but I think there's a lot of depths to plumb to this passage that maybe you've not thought about or you've not experienced. And I was excited to dig into this passage and to really understand exactly what there is that is a challenge and a hope and a comfort for us in this picture of Jesus and who he is, and in this continuing story of Jesus and his ministry on earth that leads to the cross and the resurrection in the book of Mark. I think this is an awesome addition to that story that paints the larger picture of who Jesus is. So we're going to talk about that today. I have three big points that we're going to be walking through as we break down the passage. The first is the question of who is this man? Who is this guy that is walking on water? And then I'm going to answer it, so spoiler alert, this man is God, and there's actually some clues in the passage that Mark is telling the story in such a way that we're supposed to understand that he is alluding to Jesus as God. And then finally, we will talk about how this God-man defeats the chaos of sin. So I'm going to break down what that means and how this story lends itself to that. Let's get right into the passage, though. So Mark 6:45-52. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. If you remember what happened leading up to this event, this would be Jesus creating this new food and feeding this crowd of 5,000 people of the loaves and the fish. Another story we're probably all very familiar with, have heard a lot of times. And actually, there's this continuation of it, because it says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat afterwards, and he wanted them to go ahead of them to cross to the other side of the lake and then he wanted some time alone to pray, so he was expecting to meet them on the other side. But we actually see some of the aftermath of this episode of the loaves and the fish in that the disciples hadn't understood and that their hearts have been hardened. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Now, up until this point, the case has been building for Jesus as being something rather unique, right? Something very interesting, if nothing else. And again, we come into this book reading it, knowing and believing and understanding who Jesus is to a much greater degree. But if you're an original reader of the book of Mark, or if you're one of the characters in the story, you don't have any of the benefits of the hindsight of knowing who Jesus is, what he's going to do, why that matters. Okay, you are, in a sense, learning about Jesus as it goes along. Okay, and Jesus is offering hints as to who he is. The author of the book, Mark, is offering hints as to who this guy is. But again, it's all going to culminate at the very end when we actually see him go up on that cross and then rise again. And that being the culmination of not only of his whole ministry, but of the entire Bible. So Mark is telling us a story, and Jesus is living out this life that is pointing at that and giving hints to it. And so I think it's a good exercise for us to come to the book sometimes, to come to the Gospels, and to try to suspend our knowledge of what's happening already, so that the force of what is being told to us in the book can hit us in new and fresh ways, in ways that are going to hopefully amaze us. And so come to this text with me and just ask the question, who is this man? Let yourself be building this up as you read through the book with the disciples, because as we'll see, that this is something to them that is kind of been surprising. So again, with this, I want to use the analogy of Adrian Peterson, right? Because in the passage itself, it says that they had been amazed by him, but they hadn't quite understood. Their hearts had been hardened before that. Now, I don't know if you all remember this season by Adrian Peterson in 2012. I don't know how many of you are big Viking fans. I see Dan has got his Viking polo on, so there's at least one of you here. But this is one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in sports in my life. And I think for most of you, you'd probably say the same thing, right? This is the season that Adrian Peterson came 9 yards short of breaking the single-season rushing record. And for those of you who aren't big football fans, it's a pretty big deal. That's a lot of yards, a lot of running around for him that led to that. It would be a record that would be, comparable to the home run record in baseball, which is just kind of this sacred record. And I remember living through this because every week Adrian Peterson is running for 200 yards, and every week I'm like, there's just no way he can do this again. There's no way that he can accomplish this. There's all this expectation, all this pressure on him to go out and continue to perform. And the teams that he's playing, they all understand that if they're not careful, he's going to do the same to them. So they're going to go out of their way to shut this guy down. And every week, he just kept doing it over and over again in new and astounding ways, right? And I think we're supposed to understand that Jesus and his ministry is kind of been like this so far, right? He keeps doing things that keep amazing people. They keep raising their knowledge of who this guy is beyond what they had thought before, in new and surprising ways, in ways that they probably thought there's nothing that he could do to surprise me now. He just multiplied these loaves and these fish. Like, he had been healing people, he'd been exorcising demons, he had been teaching and preaching in such a way that he was kicking the butts of these Pharisees and these other people. And this happens again, right, where Jesus amazes them, it says, as he walks on the water. And I remember this season with Adrian Peterson, too. Despite the fact that I was constantly amazed by him every week, I kept hardening myself towards it, too, because I've been a Vikings fan my whole life. I understand what it's like to be a Vikings fan, right? You should know better than to get your hopes up too much for the Vikings, right? So you kind of want to harden yourself towards that because you don't want to get let down, right? So you are actively hardening yourself to this expectation because you're like, I know if I get my hopes up, they're just gonna be dashed, and that's what happened. He finished 9 yards short of the record. I mean, he got as close as you could to breaking this record, and then he didn't do it. And then, of course, the first round of the playoffs, I think he got completely shut down by the Packers. So it was pretty anticlimactic. But still, I wanted to be amazed, even though I was trying to harden myself towards it. And we see this a little bit with the disciples, okay? It says that they were completely amazed by Jesus, even though before that they had been hardened. Now, I'm not entirely sure what Mark means there when he says that their hearts have been hardened about the loaves. It could have been that they had hardened themselves towards it because they just were, this anticipation and expectation of the Messiah coming was something that faithful Israelites had been waiting for centuries. And they had been waiting and waiting and waiting, and they didn't want to get their hopes up. It could have been something like that. It could have been something else going on behind the scenes. Maybe they were upset that Jesus had decided to feed all these other people when they had kind of just wanted to leave. They had kind of just wanted Jesus to minister to just them. It could have been a whole variety of different things, and I'm not entirely sure what it was. But I think it's interesting that Mark kind of compares amazement and hardening of the heart as antithesis of one another, as kind of opposites of each other. You're either amazed or you're hardened. And this reference to being hardened, I think, is a reference, it's supposed to elicit a remembrance back to Pharaoh and his heart being hardened, right? That's kind of, you see this in the Bible of people's hearts being hardened, and this happens every once in a while. But the first place we see it is with Pharaoh in Egypt, and this is where Moses keeps coming and preaching and saying, hey, let my people go. God, this God of this people who you have enslaved, I want you to let them go. And Pharaoh's heart keeps getting hardened, even though God continues to do more and more signs to assert his power and his dominance and his glory over against Pharaoh, who thought himself the king of the world, right? Pharaoh thought of himself as the most important human being on the entire planet. For him to be stood up by this God of this puny slave nation was a major affront to him. So it says that his heart is continually hardened towards these amazing acts that God is doing, as opposed to being amazed by them and wanting to love and serve this God of these Israelites as well. Okay, so we see that happening to the disciples. And the question is still out there, who is this guy exactly? And Mark is trying to tell us who this guy is. And that's where we're going to go in this next section here, okay? This next section where Mark kind of lays out for us in the text that he's actually painting a picture of Jesus as if he's God. And he does that through allusion. Okay, so allusion it's an expression designed to call something to mind without mentioning it explicitly. It's an indirect or passing reference. A lot of you are familiar with this word, but I really want us to understand what it means because Mark uses it very well here. An idea of an allusion in a way that means something could be used say a politician is giving a speech, and they reference the phrase inalienable rights. Now, we all know what that phrase means. Even if he's not quoting, he's going back to and quoting the Declaration of Independence, we know that he is referring back to that, and that when he refers back to that, he not only makes you think of it, makes you think about the history of that phrase and the gravity that goes towards it, right? Because the whole reason that the founders are using this word is to try to say, in a polemical way against the King of England, you have been infringing on these inalienable rights. Okay, you have been taking advantage of our rights, so it's like a challenge to a tyrant who is taking away people's rights. So when you refer back to that phrase, you bring in the history of it, and it also frames the importance of whatever speech you're giving by referring back to that, and brings it into the new modern day context, and it gives whatever you're saying, however you're using that word, this extra weight to it beyond what it is that you're saying, just by alluding to it. Okay, we all do this tacitly because we all understand the weight and the gravity of this phrase. Okay, well, Mark does this in ways that we're not going to necessarily notice because unless we know our Bibles really well. And so actually, the reading of Job 9 earlier today. That's actually intentional. I want to try to set the stage for us because I think Mark is alluding to it. So let me go back to it here, though, first of all. Mark 6:47 says, "Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake." Okay? Immediately we can picture this in our minds, but there's an allusion here that's going on to Job 9. So in Job 9, 5-8, it says, "He," this being God, "moves mountains without their knowing it, and overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. He speaks to the sun and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens, and he treads on the waves of the sea." So we see here this picture that Job is presenting of God as one who treads on the water. He walks on the water. And Mark is making this reference back to Jesus, and Jesus is aware of this too, right? That this reference goes back to Job. Okay, but there's not just that, right? In and of itself, that might seem like a kind of a thin strand to place this argument that Mark is alluding to it on. But there's actually more here, okay? Mark 6:47 goes on to say, "He was about to pass by them, and immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take courage, Uzziah, do not be afraid.'" Now, this phrase has puzzled commentators for years and years. It's a really kind of cryptic phrase. What does that mean that Jesus was about to pass by them? Was it like he just was like so focused on where he was going that he didn't even notice the disciples straining over there? That's not it, because it says right before this that he did see that. Is it that he was just like, I just don't want to, they can swim, right? They'll be fine. I don't got time to deal with this. You know, it's really cryptic to understand what's going on here. And why would Mark include this phrase in his passage? Well, I think if we go back to Job, we have another answer for it. Okay, in Job 9:11, it says, "When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him." The point being that we can't quite comprehend God. He frustrates us, and so we're hardened because of that. Because we don't understand him, that can cause us to be amazed or to be hardened. That's what Job is saying, quite comprehend. Now, this is also, I think, a reference back to Exodus. Moses is asking God to show him his glory. He's on the mountain, he's waiting for God to show him his glory so that he can know that God is going with the Israelites as they go out from Mount Sinai. And the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you on a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." And then again in Mark 6, it says, "It is I," don't be afraid. "It is I think is a reference as well back to Exodus, where God says to Moses, and this is the first time we see the name of Yahweh coming out. This is the name Yahweh, or Jehovah, comes from the transliteration of this phrase in Hebrew, "I am who I am." Jesus saying, "It is I," seems to be a reference to "I am who I am." So this passage is chock full of references that are equating Jesus with God, okay? Mark, through allusion, is equating Jesus with God, I think. And again, like we talked about, Mark is painting this picture for us of who this guy is, right? The book of Mark starts out kind of innocently. It just talks about this guy, Jesus, showing up, and then God is very pleased with him, his spirit rests on him, and then he just kind of jumps into his ministry. It's a little bit mysterious as to who he is, and as it moves on, Mark is fleshing out for us who this guy is. And this is again, it's subtle, but it's also bursting forth for us if we are understanding it. And again, I don't want this to just wash over us, because we all already believe that Jesus is God in this room, or many of us likely do. I don't want this to just be something that goes in one ear and out the other, because, again, Mark is not just making this point to try and say something really cool, right? Like a cool doctrinal point, everybody. Guess what? Jesus is God. You weren't expecting that, were you? he's actually making a point about who Jesus is in a way that says something about who God is, right? If you want to truly understand who God is, the first place you should look is to Jesus, because that's the place where God has chosen to reveal himself most fully to us, is in the person of Jesus Christ. Again, going back to Job 9, when he goes by, I cannot perceive him. Richard Hayes says, thus in Job 9, the image of God's walking on the sea is linked with a confession of God's mysterious transcendence of human comprehension. God's passing by is a metaphor for our inability to grasp his power. And going back to the disciples and their amazement versus their being hardened, I think that this is going to play out in one of two ways for us as well. Are we going to be amazed by God and his transcendence, or are we going to be hardened by it? Now, we're going to continue to talk about that idea as we move forward, but I want that to be in your minds, okay? This leads us to our third and final point. This God-man defeats the chaos of sin. Now, the sea it's not, again, Mark is being very conscious of how he's telling a story, and Jesus is very conscious of what he's doing when he's walking on the water, because the sea is not just, it's not just this, again, it's not just a fun miracle that Jesus is doing. And he's like, hey, you can't walk on water, but I can. I'm pretty cool, and you're not as cool as me. The sea actually has a lot of importance to it. This is a quote from a big academic book. Don't worry about it. It says, God is often described as fighting or subduing destructive waters such as the sea and the mighty waters, which are often personified as sea monsters like Leviathan. Okay, we see this in Job as well. The water motif is used to indicate that God's enemies are destined to be destroyed by him, whether they are the historical enemies of Israel or spiritual enemies. So we see throughout the Old Testament, the sea is portrayed as representing God's enemies, whether that be spiritual forces like demons or the adversary Satan, or maybe actual physical enemies like other nations. Or, it's used in a polemical way to say, because God has tamed the sea or defeated the sea monster Leviathan, we see that in the Psalms as well as in Job, he has therefore defeated his enemies. Also worth knowing is this idea that the sea represents chaos. And it's kind of somewhat well known that the Jewish people didn't really like the sea very much. They were more of a land-based people. At the height of their empire under Solomon, instead of creating their own fleet, they contracted out to other nations to basically be their fleet, because they just didn't really want to deal with the water. And we can kind of forgive them for that. In the book Moby Dick, this is a big theme. It's a quote. I don't know who's talking here because I've never read the book, but consider the subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide under the water, unapparent for the most part, and treacherously hidden beneath the loveliest tints of azure. Consider also the devilish brilliance and beauty of many of its most remorseless tribes, as the dainty, embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, carrying on eternal war since the world began. Right, the sea is this place of mystery and chaos and danger, and so it perfectly represents God's enemies. And that's why we see the Old Testament authors picking up on this in the Old Testament. And again, Mark is completely aware of this. Now, when we talk about chaos and destruction and the powers of sin that work behind us, behind the scenes of what we know, in us, in the world, through the powers and the authorities, it's hard to not think of all of the chaos that we experience on a day-to-day basis, right? And we're jarred by this a lot of times. We're a very comfortable society, and so when things like chaos or true evil jump out at us, we're a lot of times taken off guard. We're surprised by it. Think of the London attacks, right, where ISIS attacks at there's several times in London recently, right? The chaos of that, the way that throws off even us who are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away, it throws us off. It causes us to fear and to be afraid. These Syrian gas attacks that we found out about recently, this government using its own chemical weapons on its own people, right? The terror of these evil rulers who are ruling over their people in a tyrannical way and saying, if you don't get in line with me, I'm just gonna kill you because I can. The ambiguity and the chaos that we have going on with this fear of police that we have, and also the fear of by police on the part of other people, right? And this isn't so much about right or wrong, it's just about the ambiguity, the discord of it all, the fog of everything that's going on, the confusion that we have, this chaos that we have in this kind of discussion of police and different communities that feel marginalized by the police. Or finally, the Steve Scalise shooting that happened a few weeks ago at that baseball practice, right? The chaos and the war we have between different political factions or different ideas of the way the country should be run. And it just gets ratcheted up. It just gets ramped up. Okay? These forces of sin and chaos are the same ones that are being represented in the Old Testament by the sea and by Mark as well. And so when we talk about this chaos of sin and death, there's two ways that we can usually respond that are bad, right? The first is that we would respond with a despair that leads to feeling defeated by them, right? A despair that the powers of sin and chaos, whether they're out in the world or they're inside of us, have defeated us, right? And we have no power over them, and we should just accept that. There's nothing we can do. We've lost, and we live in a place of despair, of hopelessness, that this can never be defeated, that we can never rise beyond it, whether that's ourselves or as a society. Or we can respond by being shaped in the image of that despair, being shaped in the image of that evil and that chaos and that sin and that death. In the song By Thy Mercy that we played today, actually, there's a line in there, when I noticed that I was really excited, because it talks about the hardening power of sin. Now, this idea of hardening, whether that's going on with Pharaoh or it's going on with the disciples, these are both forms of that hardening. This is the hardening of despair is a hardening of I am not going to hope anymore. I'm going to be hardened towards any hope or any chance of defeating this chaos and this sin and this death. Or the hardening that causes us to be hardened as we're shaped in the image of that evil, that sin that is doing evil towards us. Miroslav Volf says that we choose evil, right? That's a fundamental part of human nature in and of itself, that we choose evil, we choose sin and death because we are in the image of Adam. But evil also chooses us, and it exerts its terrible power over us. Carl Gustav Jung wrote, "It is a fact that cannot be denied. The wickedness of others becomes our own wickedness because it kindles something evil in our own hearts. Evil engenders evil." So many times, even if a group was innocent to start, they get formed in the image of that evil that was done to them by lashing out and responding in the same way. And in a world that was ruled by sin and chaos, that might make sense, right? A world where the only way to respond to evil is to do back evil. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. A world of strict restorative justice. Justice being lashing back out at the one that's done evil to you in an evil way. And I think when we talk about, like these attacks in London, these Syrian gas attacks, the controversy over police, or the Steve Scalise shooting, we're talking about stuff like this. We're at a point where nobody's innocent in any of these conflicts anymore, because the evil of one group that may have been done to start the whole deal has now turned into the evil of the persecuted, the victims. So now it's just evil going back and forth. Sin has completely taken over. This chaos, this confusion, this fog of war that happens when we introduce evil and chaos into the picture has won seemingly because everyone is responding in that way. And that's the world we live in right now, right? That is the place that we live in, whether it's in a small scale, when we feel like slighted by someone we work with and we feel like we want to get them back, right? As small as that, or as big as these really big issues that I'm talking about. Okay? Now, Mark, in talking about Jesus walking the water, I think has something to say to us, to speak to us in this place. And by doing this, he's referring to other passages in the Bible where it specifically talks about how Jesus responds to this. You should have already gone through this in Mark chapter 4. Jesus gets up, he rebukes the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. This is when they're in the boat and Jesus is trying to have a little nap. And he's prepared to sleep through the storm apparently, and his disciples wake him up. And Jesus gets up and almost like a little perturbed, he just says, "Hey, be quiet." I think a good paraphrase of this, especially related to what we're talking about now, that Jesus would be saying to the water, to the powers of sin and chaos, if we allow that idea of the waters representing, in the Israelite imagination, right? In the imagination of the people reading Mark, in the imagination of the people in the boat even, the characters in the story, Jesus saying to the water is like him saying, "End your chaos and destruction, I have power over you. Calm down." The sea, which would normally be a terrible place when a storm like this pops up, you are not going to be this anymore because I have power and authority over you. Now, Jesus goes beyond it, I think, in Mark 6, right? In this story, Jesus goes even further than that. Further than asserting that he has some power over the chaos of the waters, now we see him, as he sees the disciples straining at the oars, he's going out and he's walking on the lake. This idea of walking on the lake brings in this idea of evil being under the heel of Jesus. That was the sermon title I had. In 1 Corinthians 15, 24 to 26, it says, "Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom of God the Father," he being Jesus, "after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." Okay, so this idea of Jesus walking on water elicits this understanding of evil and all of his enemies being represented in Mark in the waters being under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed then is death, for he has put everything under his feet. The definition of under his heel, this may be a phrase that you are familiar with, just means that you're completely controlled by another person or another group. Right? You are completely vulnerable, completely at the will of this person whose feet you're under, whatever that is. And that's a phrase that we see being used even back into the Roman period, this idea of someone being under the feet of another. It means you've been completely defeated by them, you're completely at that mercy, completely vulnerable to them. And Jesus in 1 Corinthians, and then going back to Mark, is showing that the powers of sin and chaos and death, these enemies that are aligned against him, are under his feet. He's completely defeated them. To the point that in Revelation 21:1, this picture of the new heavens and the new earth, what it will look like when we are finally in a place of paradise, Jesus is fully reigning over the entire earth. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." Right? What John is doing here in Revelation is painting a picture. Again, it's a little bit subtle. He's not breaking this down for us, but he's saying that at this point, when Jesus is reigning fully, when he returns, it's not just that he can walk on the water, it's completely gone. Chaos and sin and death and destruction, these enemies of God, are completely gone in the new heaven and the new earth. And that being represented by there no longer being any sea. There no longer being any of these forces aligned against God. And where does this happen? Where is the place that this ultimately takes place? And this is where we're going to bring it back to the book of Mark. We're going to bring it back to the story of Jesus that's being told throughout the book. That's all building towards the end, towards the cross. Okay? Because Jesus, this God-man, this guy who is both God and fully man, he defeats the chaos of evil and sin and the chaos of sin and evil and death on the cross. Okay, this is the place where he does it. In Colossians 2:13-15, it says, "He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross." Okay, he is our sin that would have condemned us, that would have kept us under the heel of sin and death. It would have kept us under their heel. Jesus has done away with our legal indebtedness, and it's been nailed on the cross. It's been taken away from us completely by his sacrifice on the cross. And in doing that, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Now, this is something that has already happened. Okay? So when we feel this fear that this fear that is caused to us by whatever the sin and chaos that you feel personally is, whether it's something as small as family drama, something as small as work situation, something larger than that, some of the things I brought up before, when we feel the need to either be despaired by that or to be hardened by that, by being formed in the image of that, by responding in kind, we can see that Jesus has given us hope so that we don't need to despair on the cross. And he's broken the cycle of responding in sin back towards the evil that is done towards us by saying, you don't have to because I've already defeated them. Okay? There's no reason for you to respond in that way because I've already defeated them. They have no power over you. Even if you feel slighted, even if you feel despairing, there's no reason to, because Jesus has already defeated them on the cross, which guarantees for us this final victory that will come when the sea is no longer there anymore, when Jesus returns someday. So, as I close today, I have a challenge for you. I want to ask you, who is Jesus? Ask yourself that question. And as you do, are you going to be amazed by that? Amazed by the Jesus who walks on water, who defeats the chaos of evil, of sin, and in death? Or are you going to be hardened by that for some reason? Are you going to be hardened like the disciples were, like Pharaoh was? Are you going to reject that for some reason and go to a place of despairing or being formed in the evil that you feel is done to you? That's my challenge to you today, is to go out and to ask yourself that question and to live in the hope and the glory of the fact that Jesus has defeated all sin and death, defeated any power over us, and defeated any power out there in the world completely on the cross for us. I'm going to pray to close us. Father, we thank you so completely that you have come in the form of Jesus, or you yourself came, because you were the only one that could actually accomplish any of this, Lord. We know that only you could tread on the waters. Only you could do these things that needed to be done, Lord, to set us free from sin and to defeat the powers of sin and death in us and in the world, Lord. Only you could do it. And you did that in your Son, Jesus, and we want to praise you with everything that we have now because of that, God. We are blessed so much more than we ever deserve. And this world does not deserve you, Lord, but you came anyway. Like Bruce was saying, your mercies are new every single morning for us. And they are that, Lord. They are mercies. We don't deserve this, but you come anyway. I pray that we would be people that would, instead of being shaped by the evil around us, will be shaped by that truth. We'd be shaped by what you've done for us and in us, Lord, every single day, in every single situation. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.